Okay. Okay, so I will try to be fast. I think I prepared a bit for a longer presentation, so I will try to really rush through, and if you have any questions, just please ask later. So I'm going to talk about visual working memory and its impairments in Parkinson's disease. So just to give a bit of a context, what is visual working memory? Sorry about that. Well, visual working memory is a set of processes. It's described sometimes as a system that enables short-term visual information maintenance and manipulation. So quite often it's described as short-term memory plus certain processing functions. So very often it's also pointed out that it's a core cognitive phenomena, that in simple ways can also put that it's used in everything that requires keeping information in mind. So visual working memory, as I mentioned, is a core phenomena, and mostly because it's involved in many processes and in many functions. So first of all, it's involved in higher visual processing, such as saccadic integration or binocular integration. It also was shown to underline many higher cognitive functions, most notably fluid intelligence, but also such large range of aptitude measurements and skills as math abilities, reasoning, reading, and so on. And because it's such an important phenomena, it has been shown to be impaired or have a certain deficits in a wide range of of neurodegenerative or psychiatric impairments. So again, it's most notably established in schizophrenia, but also in great number of neurodegenerative disorders such as Parkinson's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and even ALS. So it's not a question that visual working memory is important. It's maybe a question of how to measure it properly, because it's a general problem quite often. So I will present two ways how it can be measured. So the first one is behavioral index. It's called behavioral index K. It was popularized by Luck and Vogel in the seminal paper in 1997. And it came when they introduced a change detection task. It's a very simple task. Basically, you show people some set of memory items, objects. In this case, it's just squares with colors. Then you just keep a blank screen for some very short time. And then you give them a test array when they have to report if any of these squares has changed or not. So it's very simple. But it's also a very powerful paradigm, because it gives very reliable results. And using this paradigm, you can then derive this behavioral visual working memory capacity index K, that it's basically derived from the accuracy parameters. And based on how accurate people can remember different sizes, so in this case it's 8, we can define how big is the memory capacity. So by using this very simple design and very simple formulas, Vogel and Luck, they found out some very stable properties of visual working memory. So first of all, that its capacity is very highly limited. It was kind of known fact in general for short-term memory, but it's a very well now established and repeatable measurement. So the average visual working memory capacity is only about 3 to 4 items. And basically, once the set sizes increases, the performance really drops dramatically. We also showed that despite that it's quite a short range, I mean, it's quite a small this capacity, there are some great individual differences, and it can range from 1.5 to 6. On the other hand, it's a very stable measurement for a person, so it's very repeatable in different circumstances, in different, using different stimuli. And so by being a stable for every person and yet variable among the people, it becomes a very valuable tool to show the relation to other cognitive phenomena and try to explain the variations in such things as intelligence and so on, because it's a very stable measurement. However, this behavioral index, it's like an overall estimation of the capacity, so it's very suitable for certain situations when we need to know a general performance of a person, but we cannot really probe into the different phases and stages of visual working memory. So that's when the electrophysiological marker, the EEG marker, was developed. It's called contralateral delay activity. And it comes, well, the background of it is that it was long known that visual working memory is accompanied by so-called negative slow wave in the posterior areas, but it was always very difficult to know which part of this negative slow wave is actually related to working memory, which is to task difficulty, to effort, and so on. So it's the same group that in 2004 we used the contralateral control method. It's a subtraction method from one hemisphere from the other. And they actually used the same change detection task, but with the lateralization, so we can perform the subtraction. And we isolated the activity that is related to the visual working memory maintenance. So basically, we could show that the contralateral and ipsilateral activities are different depending on which side the person was cued to memorize. And the CDA, in the sense, is just actually the difference between these two waves. Okay, so what is important about the CDA is that it actually really mimics the behavioral measurements. So it can also reflect the number of objects that are kept in a working memory. So here's based on our actual data. So for instance, this is a waveform showing 4 items being maintained in the working memory, while this is the 2. So you can always really clearly see these differences. And these are differences online. It also reaches similar as behavioral measures the asymptote of the amplitude, meaning that it cannot keep decreasing. This is inverse scale, so it cannot keep decreasing, usually on average 3 to 4 items. So it gets saturated, and it also well reflects the individual differences, similar as behavioral measurement with 1.5 to 6. So this example again from the Vogel's group, that we show that behavioral estimates and the electrophysiological estimates will really correlate very well. Okay, so why CDA is important? Mostly because it allows to use a bit more complicated, it allows better understand what's really happening with working memory. So one of the most important discoveries in the field regarding the control mechanisms was done about so-called filtering efficiency. Again, the same group showed that if the people are asked to remember just red items, in this case 2 items, and ignore the blue ones, there are a certain amount of people that can do it very well. So they ignore and they remember only 2 items, while there is so-called low-capacity individuals that just cannot suppress this, and they just remember everything. So in a sense, what we proved that very often it's not just about the capacity that it's limited, but certain people cannot ignore and resist the distractors, and they don't really have smaller capacity. They just keep remembering information that maybe is not relevant. Now, filtering efficiency became a very important discovery also for all the medical applications, because it's been shown that in many disorders, it's actually not the capacity itself that may be impaired, but actually filtering efficiency that is now then pointing to another processes and another possible mechanisms. Okay, and of course, filtering efficiency is again very related to the individual memory capacity. Okay, so why it's relevant in a Parkinson's disease? Well, it it's known that in Parkinson's disease in general, apart from this very known and well-established motor deficits, there are also deficits in executive functions, in goal-directed behavior, mostly reward learning and reinforcement learning and similar. It's also known that these cognitive deficits are caused by the same underlying dopaminergic deficits and depletion. And at the same time, both visual working memory capacity and filtering efficiency was shown to be impaired, meaning that we have these two types of deficit. And in that sense, both behavioral capacity index K and CDA can be used as valuable markers to probe into these deficits and just get a better insight. Okay, so that would be it. And do you have any questions?